Hello again, and very welcome to the chapter about eliminating key pieces. This is a very important part of exchanges. In the previous two chapters, we were seeing how virtually any exchange favored the side with either a material or positional advantage. Here, on the other hand, we will have a look at some cases where we are interested in eliminating a specific enemy piece. Very often, we are speaking about good bishop because in some structures you can have a good bishop and a bad bishop depending on the pawn structure. Let's see what this is about. Before we move into the first example, I just wanted to show you that this kind of thinking, how to swap the opponent's key pieces, it can be applied even in the opening. So I wanted to show you one simple case from opening theory when we play the French defense, e4, e6, white plays d4, d5. One important variation here is e5, the advanced variation. Black usually plays c5, and after c3, the typical move here is knight c6. However, there is one variation which is a bit different, where black plays at this moment, let's say queen b6. And after knight f3, black plays bishop d7. I'm sure you have seen this at some moment. What's the point of bishop d7? Why don't they play the typical move knight c6, attacking the pawn on d4? Well, it turns out that what black is looking for here is the exchange of their bad bishop, so to speak, the bishop on light squares, for white's good bishop, the bishop on light squares as well. Not always we can simplify in this way. Sometimes actually the, so to speak, bad bishops turn into good bishops and so on. But anyway, it's a good pattern to keep in mind. So whatever white plays here, let's say they play something like a3, black is interested in taking on d4 and then play bishop e5. In this way, they assure the exchange of white's good bishop, so to speak. So this is the kind of situation that I'm speaking about. As you can see, this is a way in which black can play from the very beginning, looking for favorable exchanges. I'm not claiming that white is better here, that black is better here, of course, but it's important to understand this way of thinking. Try to swap your opponent's most important pieces, and typically we are speaking here about bishops. All right, let's move into the first example. In this game between Pickett with the white pieces and Jon Timman playing black, as you can see, we have some kind of reversed King's Indian here. Black has gained space by means of d4 at some moment, and white hurried to play f4, putting pressure on black's pawn chain. These positions are really complex. One interesting situation here is regarding the black king. Sometimes if black castles very early, castle short, well, white would consider then a pawn storm on the king side, typical King's Indian idea with reversed colors. But also black could castle long, and in that case, this plan wouldn't be that strong anymore. So many things to think about here. It was white to play. They could of course play something like f5, but like I'm saying here, black would keep their bishop. Definitely now we can say that this is black's good bishop, and this bishop is perhaps not so good in this structure for now due to so many pawns being located on dark squares. And you can take it for granted that black won't castle short here. They're going to castle long, and in this sense it won't be that easy for white to attack anymore. They can, of course, advance the pawns, but in the end, there won't be black king there to attack. So that explains why at this moment, Pickett looks for other options, other ideas, and he notices a very important tactical idea here. We can say tactics at the service of strategy, because it would be great to swap this bishop on e6. But it's not easy to do it, because we cannot just play like bishop h3, because the bishop is hanging, right? Well, if we look a little closer, we can see that actually we can do that. We can play here bishop h3. That's exactly what happened in the game, because we can rely on this little tactical trick. Bishop takes h3, queen h5 check. We don't win anything here. We don't win material. Simply we're able to swap our opponent's most important piece. You could say one of their most important pieces, the bishop on e6, the good bishop, so to speak here. And white's bishop is not that powerful right now, so it's a good trade for white. Anyway, bishop h3 was played in the game. Just a quick look what happens if black rejects this trade. If they play here bishop f7 instead, I think that what would have happened here is that white could now use this diagonal. No reason to take on d7. This bishop is, don't get me wrong, this bishop is not bad anymore. It's a very good bishop now. It's cutting like a knife. What white could do, I mean, is rather to use this diagonal with their queen. So queen g4 would come up here. And now, as you can see, we're attacking the pawn on g7, and also we're putting some pressure on the knight on d7. So it's understandable that Timman didn't like the picture of leaving the white bishop unattended on the h3 c8 diagonal. He instead took on h3 Queen h5 check, g6, queen takes h3, white got the bishop back. Now, as you can see, they're very happy that black has no light squared bishop anymore. The queen is strong. There is even a slight problem for black with the e6 square. Black should be careful here. At some moment, maybe, just maybe, the white queen might go there. So in the game, knight b6 makes a lot of sense. In this way, black is ready to play queen d7 perhaps, or queen c8, challenging the white queen. But here, Piquet notices that it's time to strike. Before black gets their pieces in order, white can play for an initiative. As you can see from the very beginning, white is better developed, they are already castled, and this means that now they can take on e5 in order to open up the f file. I mean, when you play the King's Indian with either color, it's a typical decision whether to advance this pawn or to swap it. And it depends, I would say, to a great extent about your attacking potential. If the king is already castled, sometimes it makes sense to just advance the pawn, but another important idea of this move f4, I mean, speaking in the context of attacking the opponent's base of their pawn chain on e5, is also to open that file. So that's what happened in the game. F takes e5, now the rook is becoming very happy on f1. If black takes on c4, well, they couldn't even dream about something like this, putting the knight on e5, because, well, what white would play instead is the intermediate move e takes f6, winning a pawn here because we have a double threat against black's minor pieces. So for this reason, in the game, instead, black took on e5. Okay, if they stick to this idea of keeping the f file closed, they would suffer because now, after knight takes e5, queen takes e5, I'm sure you can guess white's next move, right? You're completely right. We didn't speak about this bishop at all, but here it comes finally. Bishop f4, very good bishop, and black is in big trouble because after queen h5, white doesn't even bother to take and leave them with a bad structure. They would play queen e6 instead, and now the black king is in big trouble. So this is something that black must avoid. That explains why in the game T-Man plays f takes e5 instead, but here definitely white is happy because now they are controlling the open f file. All right, let's see what happened in the game. Queen e6. Now there might be some idea with queen f7 check, knight takes e4, and maybe, just maybe, they could have given this check on f7. It was interesting to play like this and then take in order to leave the king a little shaky in the center. But okay, it's also perfectly possible what Piquet played in the game. Queen takes e4. Now, strategically speaking, black is in trouble. Bad bishop. Pawn on e5 is a weakness. The f file is under white's control. Long castle was played. Here it was tempting to play, of course, rook f7. Typical idea. We talked about this in the chapter about controlling files, working with the rooks. Once you control an open file, very often you can later on seize the 7th rank as well. However, probably black would play here rook f8, and somehow I feel that we're now missing the other rook. So it's actually much better the move played in the game, bishop h6 first, denying black of this square on f8. Now if they play bishop f8, definitely we will consider to play rook f7, right? So it's not so easy for black to defend here in the game. They played rook dg8, a funny looking move, but okay, they are trying to trap our bishop here. Always careful with tactics. Piquet noticed and he played rook f7. After knight d8, rook g7, white had a very pleasant position and went on to win. Summing up, what we can see in this example is that from these two bishops, you would say, I mean, simplifying a little the truth, this bishop is the good bishop and that's the bad bishop. And likewise, maybe this would be the good bishop and that's the bad bishop. And for that reason, in this typical King's Indian close structure, we're happy to swap bishops. How can that be arranged? Well, by this little tactical trick, bishop h3, so that if black takes, we can take back the bishop with the queen check. All right. Now let's see a similar case with less pawns on the board. Here we have with white pieces Smyslov and playing black is Denker. As you can see, this time the picture is even more clear to us. From these bishops, definitely this is the good bishop and that's the bad bishop, because this bishop on g7 is blocked by their own pawns, and the bishop on e6 is very important, controlling the light square, specifically the square on d5. So actually, black is in some trouble here. They would love to play d5. White must be very careful about that. If we look blindly at the pawn on d6 trying to attack it, you would suggest a move like rook d3. However, in this case, black would play here nice counter-strike d5. That's what this kind of position is about. Try to find dynamic ways of improving your position. d5 now white cannot take because the rook on c1 is hanging. So for this reason, Smyslov instead asks himself the question, which piece would I like to swap here? Which would be a good trade for me? Which is black's most valuable piece at this point? And he concludes that we're talking about this bishop. How can it be swapped? Or how can we at least try to swap it? Knight c3, so that the bishop can come to d5. I'm pretty sure that black should not have allowed this in the game. They should have played something like king h8 or king h7. But here still, I mean, the idea is that if now the bishop goes to d5, black would play their bishop somewhere else, right? But still, here, this is not the only aspect of the position. White could play something like bishop e4 instead and try to hit the pawn on g6. There are ideas such like h4, h5. Please remember what we talked about in the very beginning. Sometimes when you have a great plan, like in this case, swap bishops, don't get disappointed because you cannot actually fulfill that plan. You cannot carry out that plan. Sometimes your opponent won't let you carry out your plan and you will have to look for some other plan. And that's what we're talking about here. If king h7, trying to avoid the exchange of bishops, well, white could perhaps focus on the pawn on g6 instead by playing bishop e4. That's flexibility in strategical play. So knight c3, queen e7 was a lazy move, I would say. Bishop d5. Of course, this is simple positional basics. We try to swap their good bishop and leave them with a bad bishop. On top of it, we will have a very strong knight on d5. The rest is just a nightmare for black. King h7, now it's one move too late. Of course, Smyslov didn't think twice about swapping on e6. And here, white should start working on black's weaknesses. They played a natural move here, rook d3. The rook will come to d1. As you can see, no tricks with d5 anymore. Black doesn't have enough tactical support for that. They played in the game rook c7, rook cd1, rook f7. At least black possesses this semi-open f-file, but there is not so much to do there, unfortunately for them. Anyway, here I think it's important also to see how to use these dark squares, these light squares, I mean, weak squares. It can be used by the knight either like knight e5 or knight e4. That's a tough question, generally speaking, which is the most promising square for the knight. I think it always makes sense to look a little more into the tactics. As you can see, if we play knight e5, the knight is pretty on d5, but actually it's not doing that much. Maybe you can use it to, soften up black's queen side. It's possible to play on the whole board, of course. There are ideas like playing h4 and h5 and so on, but okay, maybe black can play h5. What I think is the best way to try to find the right decision here is to look at black's weaknesses. And since we can actually attack the pawn on d6 with 4 pieces, it makes a lot of sense to just focus on that weakness. And that's what happened in the game. Knight e4, after black's move bishop f8, safeguarding the pawn, Smyslov played here rook d5. Technical move is actually the rook, which will benefit now from the d square, the d5 square. In this way, they can later on use Alekhine's gun. You remember we talked about this when we were checking the queen. Rook d3, queen d2, put a lot of pressure. Who knows, later on, if black is able to defend with all their pieces, we could always try to get in some trick like b4, c5. You can take it for granted that black will have a hard time defending this position. Summing up what we have seen here, very important concept. We're identifying that the bishop on e6 is the good bishop and the bishop on g7 is probably the bad bishop. For that reason, we should try to swap this bishop. How can that be done? Well, by bringing the bishop to d5. For that reason, the knight should move. The best square is c3, because from there, the knight will still keep control of the center, specifically speaking, the square on d5. Later on, bishop d5, white is trying to reach some kind of good knight versus bad bishop scenario. All right, let's have a look at one more example on this topic. This time we will see it from a more defensive context, because in our next example between Geller and Sveshnikov, here we have Sveshnikov again. As you can see, black is probably slightly worse in this position. They're slightly cramped. We have a typical Sveshnikov structure, the Sicilian Sveshnikov I refer to. Here, as you can see, black has played e5 and they are left again with a weakness, a bit similar to the previous example, but okay, you will soon spot a big difference. In this sense, white is better in the long run. The pawn is weak and the white has a nice outpost on d5. Black is very far away from using their outpost on d4. So what to do here with black? Typically, we would like to create counterplay somehow b5, but okay, the pawn on a6 is hanging, the pawn on b5 is hanging, and so on. We would like to play f5, but that will also be a bit loosening here. What about exchanges then? Is there some piece from these 3 guys which is the worst one? Which of these would we like to get rid of? What do you think? Which of these 3 pieces is our least valuable minor piece? You're completely right. This bishop on e7, its only function is protecting the pawn on d6. We would be very happy to trade it for white's bishop. And likewise, you could actually claim that from the white bishops. being these 2 pawns on light squares, black is happy to swap that bishop on dark squares and leave them with a light square bishop. And that's what happened in the game. Sveshnikov found nice move here, knight e8, retreating move. Sometimes f5 might be the idea, but specifically speaking here, what Sveshnikov has in mind is to play bishop g5. Very important idea. Try to swap our worst piece. No matter what happens after that, black will be favored by not having that bishop on the board anymore. I mean, just a very quick look at our previous example. If you remember, we had this position. So that's the kind of bishop that Sveshnikov would like to avoid ending up with, right? So nice move, knight e8. After white's move, knight e5. White cannot really prevent black's plan. If queen h5, we could play here g6. And okay, if they stick close to this square on g5, okay, we have to forget about the bishop g5 plan, but we can look for other ideas. f5 comes to mind here. White lost some time with her queen. We're already creating some activity. Maybe the knight can later on join the battle from here or from there. Like we were discussing, not always you can carry out your plans. That depends to a great extent on what your opponent is doing. Here, white didn't let black achieve this idea, bishop g5, so black should look for something else. And in this case, it comes to mind to play g6 and f5, because actually we get it for free, a few extra tempi, so to speak. So knight e5 was played in the game, and Sveshnikov hurries to play bishop g5. White took on g5. Had they play here bishop e3, interesting variation, because here you can actually see that if we take on e3, we could, even after rook takes e3, consider to take on d5. Now this is a little similar to my game against Cheparinov, where we were talking about improving our knights. As you can see, if now white takes with the queen on b5, we could play queen on d5, we could play queen b6, and try to bring in knight c7, knight e6, d4. If this comes true, definitely black is taking over in the position. They would have a good knight versus a bad bishop, the opposite case, right? So you can see that black has nothing to play for here. They are actually interested in reaching this kind of dream scenario, bringing the knight to d4. That would be just fantastic. So in the game, bishop takes d5, queen takes d5, b4. This is a clever move, I think, because in this way, white gains some space, and also they can use the rook along the third rank. The similar idea that we were looking at. You remember when we saw in the rook chapter, we saw the game between Agrest with white and Brunel with black, when white used the rook in attacking fashion. But of course, here is not the same thing. Black is not so exposed on their king side. In the game, black played here f5, starting active actions. After e takes f5, rook takes f5, rook a3, queen d8, prophylactical retreat, so that if white plays rook g3, we can do something else. In the game, they played here simply rook f7. Black is now defending. It looks as if white is still better here, but actually it's not so convincing, because black is about to play here knight f6, challenging the knight on d5, and there won't be so much for white to do here. Please notice that the bishop on f1 is not particularly active at this point. b3 was played in the game, safeguarding the pawn on c4, knight f6. As you can see, this is another good trade for black here. And opposed to the previous example, again, I would like to compare with our previous example. As you can see, here we have this bishop on e6 against the bishop on f1. That's not bad at all for black. That's a good situation for black. While in our previous example, we had this situation. We had this knight versus that bishop. I mean, that makes a huge difference, no? Just look for yourself. What a fantastic knight and what a bad bishop. And here, on the other hand, Sveshnikov has a much nicer situation. This bishop is a good bishop, you could say, and the bishop on f1, at least it's not the best bishop in the world, right? Queen d2 was played in the game, queen c7, rook d3, white is putting some pressure on the pawn on d6, bishop f7, clever way of protecting the pawn from the side, and here maybe white should have considered rook d1, but okay, time for dynamics here, bishop h5, provocation, sorry, in order to make white play f3, and here black would look into the idea of playing e4 at some point, maybe giving check first, and then we play e4, and who knows what will happen here, but okay, it's clear that black has some counterplay as well. So queen e3 was played in the game, h6, rook d2, and b5. Nice dynamic idea from black's side here. They would like to swap pawns on the queen side in order to eliminate white's space advantage. After c takes b5, a takes b5, bishop takes b5, rook b8. As you can see, black is getting back the pawn. After bishop d3, rook takes b4. Black was perfectly okay, and later on the game was a draw. So very interesting play from Sveshnikov here. He noticed that this bishop is probably the bad bishop, and this is probably white's good bishop. It makes sense to swap them. How can that be done? Well, by rotating the knight to e8 specifically, so that the pawn on d6 is safeguarded, and next move will be bishop g5, trying to swap that good bishop on c1. Summing up, we have seen several interesting examples on how to eliminate key pieces In our opponent's camp, we saw how Piquet used this little tactical trick, or positional trick, call it like as you like, bishop h3, in order to make black take on s3. In this way, we get rid of their good bishop, so to speak, and black has no real control of the light squares anymore in their camp. In our next example, we have this very typical school example, how to work on weaknesses. Knight c3, Smyslov knows that the exchange of bishops will be very favorable for them. They would very much like to end up with a knight against the bishop, against the bad bishop on g7. In our last example, a typical Sveshnikov structure where black saw this little idea of swapping bishops on g5 by playing knight e8, preparing to go bishop g5 next turn in order to get rid of their problem child on e7. Alright, thanks for watching and see you in the next chapter.